Sometimes the most terrifying thing you can see in a mirror isn't what's behind you. It's what's wrong with what's supposed to be you. Marcus had always been a night owl, but lately, sleep felt more like an enemy than a friend. It was nearly 2 a.m. when he finally dragged himself to the kitchen sink. Staring down at the pile of dishes he'd been avoiding for 3 days. The apartment was dead silent, except for the distant hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of settling wood. He turned on the faucet, letting the warm water cascade over his hands as he reached for the first plate. The kitchen window above the sink had become a black mirror in the darkness outside, reflecting the dim light from the overhead fixture. Marcus caught glimpses of himself as he worked tired eyes, stubbled jaw, the same face he'd seen in mirrors his entire life. The first plate came clean easily enough. He moved to the second. He noticed his reflection seemed oddly still in the window glass. He paused, looking up directly at his mirrored image. There he was, exactly as expected, exhausted, slightly hunched over the sink, dish in hand. But something felt off. Marcus tilted his head slightly to the left. His reflection tilted to the right. He blinked slowly. The reflection blinked back, but the timing felt just a fraction of a second, delayed, like watching a badly dubbed movie. "It's tired," he muttered to himself, returning his attention to the dishes. But his eyes kept drifting back to that dark window, to the pale face staring back at him from the glass. The third dish slipped from his soapy hands, clattering against the metal sink. The sound echoed through the quiet apartment like a gunshot. As he bent to retrieve it, Marcus glanced up at his reflection, again froze. The face in the window was definitely his. Same brown eyes, same crooked nose from when he'd broken it in high school, same scar on his chin from a childhood fall. But the expression was wrong. While Marcus stared in growing confusion, his mouth slightly open in bewilderment. The reflection's mouth was slowly, almost imperceptibly, curving upward at the corners. Not into a pleasant smile. This was something else entirely. The lips were pulling back in a way that seemed to stretch too far, revealing teeth that looked somehow sharper than they should be. Marcus touched his own face, running his fingers along his jaw and lips. His mouth was slack, certainly not smiling. But in the window, that other Marcus continued to grin, the expression growing wider and more disturbing by the second. His heart began to pound. Marcus stepped back from the sink, and his reflection stepped back too. But that horrible smile never wavered. If anything, it seemed to grow more pronounced, more malevolent. The eyes, his own eyes, were starting to look different too. Darker, hungrier. "What the hell?" Marcus whispered, his voice barely audible even to himself. The reflection's lips moved in perfect synchronization with his words, but that ghastly smile never diminished. It was as if someone had carved that grin into the reflection's face, and it was now a permanent, twisted feature. Marcus reached up and turned off the kitchen light, plunging the room into darkness. For a moment, there was nothing but black glass where his reflection had been. Relief washed over him, just a trick of the light, maybe a smudge on the window, creating an optical illusion. But when he flicked the light back on, the reflection was still there, still smiling, that impossible smile. Worse, it seemed to have moved closer to the glass, as if it had used those few seconds of darkness to press its face nearer to the window's surface. Marcus stumbled backward, his hip catching the edge of the kitchen counter. Pain shot through his side, but he barely noticed it. Let the thing in the window, because he could no longer think of it as his reflection was, now grinning so widely that it looked like his face might actually split in half. "Stop it," Marcus said, louder this time. "Stop smiling." But the reflection didn't stop. If anything, the grin seemed to widen further, defying the physical limitations of a human face. The corners of its mouth had stretched so far that they seemed to disappear beyond the edges of its cheeks. And those eyes were now completely black, like twin voids that that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Marcus wanted to run, but he found himself transfixed by the horror of it. This thing that looked like him but wasn't him, that moved like him but expressed something fundamentally alien and wrong. He watched in sick fascination as the reflection raised one hand. His hand impressed its palm against the inside surface of the glass. The apartment's temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees in an instant. Marcus could see his own breath misting in the suddenly frigid air. But the reflection's breath didn't fog the glass at all. That's when Marcus realized the most terrifying thing of all. The reflection was no longer perfectly mirroring his movements. While Marcus stood frozen in horror, his hands clenched at his sides, the reflection was moving independently. It tapped its fingers against the glass in a slow, deliberate rhythm. Tap, tap, tap. The sound seemed to come from inside the window itself, resonating through the glass and into the kitchen. But that was impossible. The window was sealed, and there was nothing outside but a 3-story drop to the alley below. Marcus forced himself to move, backing toward the kitchen doorway without taking his eyes off the window. The reflection watched him go, its head turning to track his movement, while that horrific grin never faltered. Even as Marcus reached the doorway, even as he prepared to flee to another room, the thing in the glass raised its other hand and waved. A slow, deliberate wave. Goodbye. Marcus ran. He didn't stop until he reached his bedroom, slamming the door behind him and diving under the covers like a child hiding from monsters. Even there, in the supposed safety of his bed, he couldn't shake the image of that grin from his mind. The next morning, Marcus called in sick to work. He spent the entire day avoiding the kitchen, ordering takeout and eating it in his living room. When evening came, he covered every reflective surface in his apartment with towels and sheets. But late that night, as he lay in bed trying to sleep, he heard it. A soft, rhythmic tapping coming from somewhere in his apartment. Tap, tap, tap. And underneath that sound, so faint he might have imagined it, Marcus could swear he heard the whisper of laughter, his own laughter, but wrong somehow, filled with a malice that made his blood run cold. The tapping continued until dawn. Sometimes the things we try to keep away find their own way back. And when they do, they bring 20 years of hunger with them. Sarah Chan had been living in her 15th floor apartment for 3 years, and in all that time, nothing had ever appeared on her balcony that she hadn't put there herself. So when she discovered the mud-caked locket sitting on her outdoor table that Tuesday morning, her first instinct was to check if any of her neighbors might have dropped it. But as she picked up the tarnished silver heart, her breath caught in her throat. Scratched into the metal, barely visible beneath the dried dirt, were her own initials. SC. The locket felt heavier than it should have, cold against her palm despite the morning sun. Sarah's fingers trembled as she worked the clasp open, though she already knew what she would find inside. 2 faded photographs stared back at her 8-year-old self on one side and on the other. Her childhood best friend Emma, both of them grinning with missing teeth and summer-bright eyes. She hadn't seen this locket in 20 years, not since the day she and Emma had buried it in the woods behind Millbrook Elementary, along with Emma's favorite bracelet and a handful of other trinkets in what they'd called their ghost trap. The memory came flooding back with startling clarity. They'd heard the stories about the Gray Laudia woman who supposedly died in those woods decades ago, and had been seen wandering among the trees ever since. When Sarah's grandmother had mentioned that some spirits could be trapped with personal belongings, their ETH-rolled minds had hatched a plan. They'd gathered their most precious items, dug a hole near the old oak tree, and performed what they'd imagined was a binding ritual, complete with chanted nonsense words in a circle of stones. Now, she can't hurt anyone, Emma had declared, patting down the dirt with her small hands. She's stuck forever. Sarah set the locket on her kitchen counter and tried to rationalize what she was seeing. Someone was playing a prank on her. Maybe Emma had remembered their childhood game and decided to dig up their old burial site. But as she reached for her phone to call her old friend, she stopped. Ma had died in a car accident 7 years ago. The apartment suddenly felt too quiet. Sarah found herself straining to hear any sound from the hallway, any indication that someone might have been in the building who shouldn't have been. But there was nothing except the familiar hum of the air conditioning and the distant traffic below. She spent the rest of the day trying to focus on work, but her eyes kept drifting to the locket. By evening, she convinced herself there had to be a logical explanation. Maybe someone had found their old burial site during construction or landscaping. Maybe they had looked up the names in an old yearbook and tracked her down. It was unsettling, but not supernatural. That night, Sarah woke to the sound of scratching. It was coming from the balcony, a slow, deliberate scraping against the glass door. She lay still in bed, listening, her heart hammering against her ribs. The scratching stopped, then started again, rhythmic and purposeful. Sarah crept to the living room window and peered through the blinds. The balcony was empty, but fresh scratches marred the glass door in vertical lines, as if something had been clawing to get in. She checked the locks twice before returning to bed, but sleep wouldn't come. Every small sound in the apartment made her jump the settling of the building. The whisper of air through the vents, the barely audible hum of the refrigerator. And underneath it all, she could swear she heard something else, a soft tapping like fingernails against wood. The next morning brought no relief. The locket had moved during the night, now sitting on the windowsill instead of the kitchen counter. Sarah was certain she hadn't touched it. More disturbing was what she found on the balcony: muddy footprints leading from the railing to the door and back again, as if someone had been pacing there for hours. But the balcony was 15 floors up. Sarah called building security, but the guard just shrugged and suggested maybe a bird had tracked mud up from the courtyard. The explanation felt hollow, especially when she noticed the prints were distinctly human-shaped, though smaller than her own feet, child-sized. That evening, she decided to confront whatever was happening. She sat in her living room with all the lights on, the locket in her hand, and spoke to the empty air. "If you're here because of what we did as kids, I'm sorry. We didn't mean any harm. We were just children playing games." The temperature in the room dropped so suddenly that her breath misted in front of her face. The lights flickered once, twice, then died completely. In the darkness, Sarah heard the balcony door slide open, though she knew she'd locked it. Footsteps moved across her floorlight, careful steps that stopped just inches from where she sat. The locket in her hands grew ice cold, and she could feel a presence looming over her, patient and waiting. "What do you want?" she whispered. The answer came not as words, but as images flooding her mind. Emma, 8 years old, digging frantically in the woods while something gray and shapeless watched from between the trees. The binding ritual they'd performed hadn't trapped the gray lady, had invited her in. It's given her a connection to the living world through their buried treasures. And when Emma died, the connection had transferred to Sarah, the only living person left from that day in the woods. The gray lady had been waiting 20 years for the right moment to collect what she was owed. Sarah felt cold fingers brush against her cheek, and she understood with horrible clarity that some doors, once opened, could never be closed. The locket fell from her numb hands as the darkness pressed closer, and she realized that she'd been wrong about one thing. The thing they'd buried hadn't been meant to keep the gray lady away. It had been meant to keep Sarah tied to her forever. The next morning, Sarah's neighbors found her apartment empty, the balcony door standing wide open. The only sign of her presence was a small silver locket on the floor, scratched and tarnished with 2 faded photographs inside. The police classified it as a missing person case, but the building's security cameras showed no one entering or leaving Sarah's apartment that night. She had simply vanished, leaving behind only questions and a story that no one would believe. But sometimes, on quiet nights, residents of the building report hearing footsteps on the empty 15th floor, The sound of children laughing in the woods that no longer exist, replaced decades ago by concrete and steel. Some things, once awakened, can never be put back to sleep. The voice on the recording wasn't hers, but somehow she was answering its questions. Chloe had always been a light sleeper, which made the discovery even more disturbing. She'd downloaded the sleep tracking app 3 weeks ago after her doctor suggested monitoring her restless nights. The app promised to record ambient sounds and track sleep patterns, helping users identify what might be disrupting their rest. What it captured instead would make sleep impossible for months to come. It started innocently enough. The first few nights yielded the usual recordings: the hum of her air conditioner, occasional car sounds from the street below, her own quiet breathing. Sometimes she'd hear herself mumble incoherently, which the app marked as sleep-talking episodes. Nothing unusual there. She'd been a sleep talker since childhood, but on the 4th night, something changed. Chloe was reviewing her sleep data over morning coffee when she noticed an unusually long audio segment. Marked at 3:17 a.m., the file was 12 minutes long, far longer than her typical brief mumbles. Curious, she plugged in her headphones and pressed play. At first, there was only the familiar white noise of her bedroom. Pain, barely audible, came a sound that made her blood run cold. Breathing, but not her own rhythmic sleeping breath. This was different, deliberate, controlled. Someone else was in her room. Her finger hovered over the pause button as a voice emerged from the static, low, raspy, like vocal cords scraping against sandpaper. The voice spoke just above a whisper. "What's your name?" Chloe's stomach dropped. She lived alone on the 3rd floor of a secure building. Her doors were locked, her windows too high for anyone to climb through. Yet there it was, clear as day, someone asking her a question in the middle of the night. Then came her own voice, soft and distant, nothing like her normal speaking tone. "Chloe." She ripped the headphones off, hands shaking. This was impossible. She would have woken up if someone had broken in. She was a light sleeper. The slightest unusual sound would have jolted her awake. But there was her own voice, calm and compliant, answering the strangest question while she slept. The raspy voice continued. "How old are you, Chloe? 28? Do you live alone?" "Yes." Each exchange sent ice through her veins. Her sleeping self was providing personal information to an intruder, and she had no memory of it whatsoever. The conversation continued for several more minutes, the entity asking increasingly personal questions about her work, her family, her fears. Her sleeping voice answered everything with the same eerie compliance. The recording ended abruptly, cutting back to normal sleep sounds as if nothing had happened. Chloe spent the day checking every inch of her apartment. Windows were secure, locks unchanged, no signs of forced entry. She called the building security, but the overnight footage showed no one entering or leaving her floor. She was going crazy. That was the only logical explanation. That night, she barely slept, jumping at every sound. The app recorded nothing unusual, just her tossing and turning until dawn. But the following night, it happened again. This time, the conversation was longer. The voice seemed more confident, more familiar with her responses. It asked about her childhood, her dreams, her deepest secrets. Things she'd never told anyone were spilling from her lips in that same detached, sleeping voice. "What frightens you most, Chloe? Being alone forever? What do you see when you close your eyes?" "Darkness. Always darkness." "What would you do for me if I asked?" A long pause. Then, in a voice so quiet, she had to turn the volume up. "Anything." That word, anything, spoken in her own voice with such absolute surrender, made her physically ill. Whatever was happening to her was getting worse. The entity was learning, adapting, building some kind of relationship with her unconscious mind. Desperate, Chloe set up a camera pointing at her bed. If someone was somehow getting into her room, she'd catch them. But when she reviewed the footage from that night, she saw only herself lying peacefully in bed, lips occasionally moving as if in conversation with empty air. The audio from the camera picked up only her side of the dialogue, her responses to questions that were there, except they were there. The sleep app proved it. She consulted doctors, sleep specialists, even a psychiatrist. They suggested everything from sleep disorders to stress-induced hallucinations. But none could explain how the app was recording a voice that did unshow up on any other recording device. The conversations grew longer each night, more intimate. The entity began sharing things about itself, if it could be called a self. It spoke of watching her for years, of waiting for the right moment to make contact. It described her apartment in perfect detail, knew her routines, her habits, her fears. It had been studying her. "Why me?" her sleeping voice asked one night, the first time she'd initiated a question. "Because you're ready," came the reply. "You've always been ready. You just needed to learn how to listen." 3 weeks after the first recording, Chloe made a decision that terrified her. She would stay awake and catch the entity in the act. She positioned herself in bed with her eyes barely open, phone ready to record video the moment anything happened. At exactly 3:17 a.m., the temperature in her room dropped noticeably. Her breath became visible in small puffs. The darkness in the corner of her room seemed to deepen, becoming almost solid. "Okay." And then she heard it, not through the app, but with her own ears, that familiar, raspy whisper. "Hello, Chloe. I know you're awake." She couldn't move, couldn't speak, couldn't even close her eyes as the darkness in the corner began to shift and take shape. It's time we talked properly," the voice continued, closer now. "You've been such a good student in your sleep, okay? But there's so much more I want to teach you." The last thing Chloe remembered was the overwhelming urge to answer, to be compliant, to say yes to whatever it asked of her. She woke up the next morning with no memory of what happened after that moment. Okay. But when she checked her phone, there was a new recording, 13 hours long. Okay. And this time, she wasn't sure she wanted to listen, because the app showed that for 13 hours straight, she had been having a conversation. Odd, she was no longer sleeping. And with that final story, we pull back from the abyss. For now, tales of ordinary lives brushing against the extraordinary, the terrifying, the unexplainable, from the shadow that mimics to the voice that calls from an empty house. We've seen tonight how thin the veil between our reality and a much darker one can be. These stories are not just fiction. They are born from real experiences, whispered in hushed tones, and shared to remind us that we are not always alone. And that's the most chilling thought, isn't it? Perhaps one of tonight's stories reminded you of something that happened to you, or to someone you know. A strange occurrence you've tried to forget. A noise in the night you rationalized away. A figure you saw for just a second. The details of your own brush with the darkness are what give this channel life. I invite you to leave your own story in the comments below. Let us know what you've seen in the shadows. If these stories sent a shiver down your spine, show your support by hitting that like button. It helps these tales reach others who need a reminder to check their locks at night. And if you haven't already, make sure you subscribe and click the notification bell. We have so many more stories to share, and you won't want to be left in the dark. Until next time, remember that you are not afraid of being alone. You are afraid of the bone-deep certainty that you are not.